If you stroll through the streets of crucial London these days, you'll see monuments to the heroes of the Second World War. You will see statues of Winston Churchill and memorials to the courageous pilots of the Royal Air Force. The story we tell ourselves approximately that war is an easy and heroic one. We are taught that Britain stood by myself against the Nazi conflict machine. We are taught that the British people sacrificed the whole lot and spent each penny they needed to defeat fascism. We are taught that by using 1945, Britain became bankrupt, to noble smash that had spent its wealth to store the arena. But there's a distinct model of this tale. It is a version that you may now not find within the college books of Harrow or Eton. It is a version this is remembered with bitterness inside the villages of Bengal and the towns of Cairo. In this model of the tale, Britain did no longer pass broke combating the struggle. Instead, Britain discovered a way to make someone else pay for it. They ran up a big tab on a credit scorecard that belonged to their poorest topics. They financed the conflict by way of extracting a forced loan from their colonies. And then, while the struggle became over, they refused to pay it lower back. This is the story of the sterling balances. It is the tale of the way the British Empire conducted the best monetary heist in records, extracting trillions of bucks from India and Egypt to subsidize the British economic system. It challenges the myth of the coolest struggle and reveals the bloodless economic calculus that allowed Britain to rebuild its welfare country on the backs of ravenous peasants. To apprehend this robbery, we ought to look past the battlefield and into the financial institution vault. In 1939, the British Empire turned into the most important buying and selling bloc inside the world. It became tied collectively now, not just via the Royal Navy, however, by a foreign money device referred to as the sterling vicinity. Guidelines of the device have been simple, however rigorous. All the colonies from India to Malaya to Nigeria had to maintain their countrywide reserves in British pound sterling. They have been not allowed to maintain gold or US dollars. They had to bank in London. This intended that the financial coronary heart of the empire become the Bank of England. When the Second World War started, Britain faced a direct financial disaster. Modern battle is relatively high-priced. You want metal, you need oil, you need rubber. And also, you need hundreds of thousands of heaps of food to feed your armies. Britain is a small island. It did no longer have those sources. It had to buy them. In the early days of the struggle, Britain used its gold reserves to buy weapons from the United States, but the gold ran out very quickly. By 1941, Britain became technically insolvent. It could no longer pay cash for the equipment of battle. This is in which the looting started. The British government found out that whilst they could not force America to offer then loose components, they might pressure their colonies to achieve this. The crown jewel of the empire turned into India. India changed into now not just a source of infantrymen. It turned into a massive manufacturer of textiles, steel food, and raw materials. The British authorities wanted these Indian items to combat the warfare in North Africa and the Middle East. But they did now not have the money to pay the Indian manufacturers. So they invented an economic mechanism that became imaginative and ruthless. It worked like this. When the British military wished uniforms or rice or metal from India, they would place an order with the Indian government. The Indian authorities might pay the neighborhood Indian producers in rupees, the nearby forex. But the British government did now not pay the Indian government back in rupees. They did not pay them lower back in gold. Instead, they sincerely made a bookkeeping entry in the Bank of England in London. They credited India's account with kilos sterling. On paper, this gave the look of a fair transaction. India turned into promoting items and Britain was procuring them. The Indian authorities changed into accumulating a massive financial savings account in London. These were the well-known sterling balances. By the stop of the battle, India held 1.3 billion pounds in those money owed. In brand new money, that is hundreds of billions of bucks. It became a fortune. It technically made India a creditor state and Britain a debtor country. But there has been a capture. A catch that became this transaction from an alternate into a robbery. The British authorities declared that these sterling balances had been blocked. India turned into not allowed to withdraw the money. They have been not allowed to alternate the pounds for dollars to shop for equipment from America. They have been not allowed to shop for gold. The catch become trapped in London. It became a frozen asset. Britain changed into effectively taking real items, actual food, and actual exertion from India and purchasing them with an IOU that couldn't be cashed. The effects of this coverage at the ground in India had been catastrophic because the Indian authorities needed to print millions of greater rupees to pay the local producers for the warfare attempt. The money supply in India exploded. But due to the fact all the products, the material, the rice, the milk, have been being shipped out of the country to feed the British army, there was not anything for the Indian humans to shop for with all that new cash. Too lot cash chasing too few goods ends in one thing: hyperinflation. The charge of rice and wheat in India skyrocketed. The terrible who lived hand to mouth observed that their day-by-day wages ought to no longer purchase an unmarried meal. This became not a twist of fate. It turned into a calculated policy. The famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, who is generally remembered as a hero of liberal economics, was a key architect of this system. He turned into an advisor to the British Treasury during the conflict. Keynes understood precisely what became taking place. He knew that with the aid of printing money in India to pay for the battle, Britain became inflicting inflation. He defined it privately as a pressured switch of fee. He knew that they were decreasing the consumption of the Indian poor to fund the consumption of the British soldier. The most scary result of this financial engineering became the Bengal Famine of 1943. We are regularly instructed that the famine became as a result of a cyclone or by the Japanese capture of Burma. Those had been factors. However, the number one motive force changed into the inflation as a result of the sterling system. The British authorities turned into printing cash to buy up all the rice in Bengal, to feed the navy, and to export to the Middle East. The charge of rice rose so high that the Bengali peasant could not come up with the money for it to consume. 3 million human beings died of hunger. They did now not die because there was no meals. They died due to the fact the economic gadget had priced them out of lifestyles. While humans were death in the streets of Kolkata, the sterling balances in London stored developing. Every sack of rice that changed into taken from a ravenous village introduced some greater digits to India's financial institution account in England. It is a grotesque image, a mountain of wealth gathering in the Bank of England that turned into literally constructed on the starvation of the empirist topics. The British officials in Delhi and London had been aware of the struggling. The Viceroy of India, Lord Lend-Lease, wrote secret letters to London caution that the economic burden on India changed into becoming unbearable. He warned that they were breaking the again of the Indian financial system. But Winston Churchill and his cabinet not noted the warnings. Their priority became defeating Hitler. If India had to be squeezed dry to pay for the victory, so be it. Churchill famously brushed off the famine, saying that Indians bred like rabbits. He considered the debt Britain become amassing to India no longer as a legitimate economic obligation, however as odd anomaly. He couldn't consider that Britain the grasp have to owe cash to India the servant. By 1945, the war changed into over. Britain had received, but the economic reckoning had arrived. The United Kingdom owed its colonies a superb amount of money. The total sterling balances owed to India, Egypt, Ireland, and other nations amounted to over £3 billion. This debt became larger than the complete gross home made of Britain. It turned into a crushing burden. The leaders of the newly independent countries anticipated to be paid. India was on the verge of independence. The Indian leaders like Nehru and Gandhi checked out the one's balances as the seed capital for his or her new kingdom. They planned to apply that money to build factories, dams, and faculties. They believed that Britain, having pressured them to sacrifice so much for the warfare, could honor its debt. They had been incorrect. The betrayal started out nearly without delay. In the negotiations that observed the conflict the British authorities made, it clear that they'd no aim of paying the overall price of the debt. They started out a marketing campaign to discredit the debt itself. Leading British figures argued that the debt became unfair to Britain. They argued that due to the fact Britain had fought the conflict to guard the empire inclusive of India, the colonies need to have contributed to the price of the conflict freely. They called the debt big and unjust. Imagine the audacity of this argument. After forcing India to provide goods, causing a famine and inflating the currency, the British now argued that India need to honestly cancel the debt as a thank you for being covered. Winston Churchill changed into the maximum vocal proponent of this view. He desired to absolutely default. He desired to inform India that the debt turned into wiped clean. He drafted memos suggesting that Britain need to present a counter-invoice to India for the value of its defense. But the brand new labor authorities, led by using Clement Attlee, found out that a total default was impossible. It might destroy self-belief in the British pound forever. If Britain truly refused to pay its money owed, no person could ever trust the town of London once more. They wanted an extra diffused way to steal the cash. They needed to find a manner to default without calling it a default. They became to the U.S. for help. In 1946, Britain turned into negotiating a big loan from America to rebuild its shattered financial system. The Americans have been skeptical They looked at the big sterling balances owed to India and Egypt, and that they worried that if they loaned money to Britain could just use it to pay return the colonies. The Americans desired Britain to default too. They desired the sterling balances written off so that Britain may want to end up a strong trading associate for the United States. But the Indian delegation at the economic conferences fought returned. They argued that this cash represented the blood and sweat of the Indian human beings. It became no longer a paper income. It changed into reimbursement for real goods that were taken. To default on it would be a theft of unparalleled scale. The British Treasury came up with a compromise that changed into basically a slow movement default. They told India that the money could continue to be blocked. India could not withdraw the precept. Britain might launch a tiny trickle of the cash each year, just enough to pay for vital imports, but no longer sufficient to develop the USA. They dealt with the cash now not as a debt that turned into due, however, as an allowance that they might grant to their former topics. This changed into the country of play because the empire started to dissolve. The money that could have converted India that might have averted the poverty of the post-colonial generation turned into held hostage in London. The British authorities used that capital to prop up their personal forex. They used it to maintain the price of the pound in order that British purchasers could purchase cheap imports. They efficaciously used the savings of the Indian peasant to subsidize the same old of dwelling of the British employee. The exceptional British welfare country, the countrywide health service, the rebuilding of British housing. All of these noble projects have been funded in component with the aid of the refusal to pay return the conflict debt to the colonies. It became a transfer of wealth from the poorest human beings in the world to one of the richest countries on earth, and this became only the beginning of the sterling lure. The actual damage might come within the years that observed as Britain manipulated the cost of the currency to wipe out the debt almost entirely. The conflict became over, and the ticker-tape parades had completed winding through the street of London. But the financial struggle became just entering its maximum ruthless segment. The state of affairs in 1947 becomes stark. India changed into, in the end, unfastened. The Union Jack got here down over the Red Fort in Delhi, and the Nurit color flag went up. But at the same time as India had won its political sovereignty, its monetary sovereignty was nevertheless locked in a vault inside the city of London. The new Indian government, led by using Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, faced a terrifying truth. Their US of A was broken. The partition of India and Pakistan had caused massive displacement and violence. The industry turned into backward. The agriculture was stagnant. They desperately needed capital to shop, for equipment to construct power plants, and to modernize the kingdom. And they technically had that capital. They owned over 1,000 million pounds sterling sitting within the Bank of England. It became their cash earned through the starvation and sacrifice of the battle years. But while the Indian finance ministers went to London to invite for his or her test, they were met with bloodless smiles and closed doors. The British authorities below Clement Attlee had set the lure. They instructed the Indians that the discharge of the balances would be strictly managed. They signed a sequence of agreements that confined India's get admission to its personal cash. India became allowed to withdraw, simplest, a tiny fraction of the entire sum each year. The excuse given turned into that the British economy changed into too fragile to handle a sudden outflow of coins. The British argued that in the event that they paid India lower back too fast, pound would disintegrate, and that would be bad for all of us, including India. It turned into a traditional, abusive relationship dynamic. The sufferer became advised they had to assist the abuser for their own excellence. India had no preference, however, to agree. The international monetary machine was rigged in Britain, as preferrer in India had no different source of hard forex. They were pressured to simply accept the drip feed. But the British Treasury had a darker plan than just delaying charge. They planned to devalue the debt away. They knew that in the event that they could not cancel the debt legally, they might shrink it economically. In 1949, the British government made a surprising and shocking assertion. They devalued the pound sterling towards American dollar by means of 30%. Overnight, the shopping for power of the British currency collapsed. For a rustic like Britain, this became painful but essential to enhance exports. But for India, it became a catastrophe. India's reserves were held in pounds. When the pound misplaced 30% of its value, India efficiently misplaced 30% of its national financial savings at the unmarried day. The equipment they wanted to buy from America suddenly have become 30% extra luxurious. The gold they wanted to buy became out of reach. Economists have calculated the dimensions of this loss. It was an immediately vaporization of wealth. By devaluing the forex, Britain successfully worn out a huge bite of what they owed to their former colonies without ever having to pay a penny. it became a default via another call, and they did now not do it simply once. Throughout the post-warfare duration, inflation in Britain ate away on the actual value of the sterling balances. The interest fee Britain paid on these accounts changed into pitifully low, a long way below the price of inflation. This supposed that every year the cash sat in London, it became worth much less and much less in terms of what it can really buy. It became like placing ice cream in an oven. Britain definitely waited for the debt to melt. While India struggled to feed its populace in the 1950s, stricken by a lack of funding in foreign exchange, Britain changed into taking part in the post-war growth. The blocked sterling balances played a crucial position on this recuperation by means of forcing the colonies to maintain sterling. Britain ensured that there has been a steady demand for their currency. It allowed Britain to stay past its method. It allowed the British authorities to maintain a global navy presence, to build nuclear guns, and to fund a beneficent social safety internet. The National Health Service, that's rightly the delight of Britain, changed into built on a foundation of financial balance that became partly subsidized by means of the forced loans from the empire. The reasonably priced food and raw substances that Britain had extracted during the warfare allowed them to hold inflation lower than it must have been. The average British circle of relatives in the 50s enjoyed a well-known of residing. That became artificially supported with the aid of the invisible transfer of wealth from the East. The tale of the sterling balances also destroys the argument that the empire was a financial burden on Britain. Apologists for the empire regularly declare that Britain spent more on its colonies than it were given back. They factor to the fee of management and protection. But the sterling trap proves the other. In the instant of Britain's greatest disaster, the empire became a cash cow. It was a resource to be tired. The economist Uta Patnik has completed vast research on the overall go with the flow of wealth from India to Britain over the colonial period. When you component in the change surpluses, the taxes and the mechanisms, just like the sterling balances, she estimates that Britain extracted $45 trillion from India. That is a range of so huge it is tough to recognize. It is 17 times the modern-day GDP of the UK. It explains why a rustic that changed into one of the richest within the global in the 18th century became one of the poorest within the 20th, even as a small island within the North Atlantic, have become an international superpower. The legacy of this looting is still seen these days. The infrastructure gap in India, the poverty that plagued the United States of America for many years after independence can be traced at once to this loss of capital. Imagine if India were able to get entry to that 1.3 billion kilos in 1947. Imagine if they could have bought the satisfactory technology from America and Germany. Imagine if they might have built high-speed pace rail in contemporary universities inside the 1950s. The trajectory of Asian history would have been exceptional. Instead, India became pressured to beg for aid from the World Bank and the IMF, regularly accepting humiliating situations while its very own money sat locked in a vault in London earning bad real hobby. The sterling entice, also well known, shows the cynicism of the post-conflict order. The establishments that were created after World War II, just like the IMF, the World Bank, have been supposedly designed to create an honest global economic system. But in truth, they have been designed to guard the interests of the creditor international locations. When the British negotiated the discharge of the balances, they frequently connected to strings. They forced India to spend the money on British items. Even though British equipment had become often previous and extra costly than American or German equipment, India became frequently compelled to buy British because their cash was in pounds. This was a double theft. First, Britain took the cash. Then, they pressured India to spend it on uncompetitive British products, efficiently subsidizing British industry 2 times. It took decades for the difficulty to be completely resolved. The balances had been launched so slowly, and their value eroded so extensively by means of inflation and devaluation, that by the point India received the final bills, the cash became a shadow of its former self. The extremely good switch of wealth that New had hoped for in no way took place. The seed capital for the brand new country had grew to become to dust. The British government never apologized for this. They in no way recounted that they had defaulted on their ethical and monetary obligations. The narrative in Britain remained that they had graciously granted independence to India. The financial fact that they had looted the country at the way out changed into buried in technical memos and financial journals. Today, whilst we take a look at this dating between the worldwide North, the global South, we regularly see it via the lens of useful resource. We see wealthy countries giving charity to bad nations. But the records of the sterling balances reminds us that the drift of cash has often gone the opposite way. The bad back the rich. The ravenous Bengali peasant sponsored the British soldier. The growing Indian economy sponsored the reconstruction of London. It demanded situations us to rethink the history of the 20th century. World War II turned into a combat against tyranny, and it is a great aspect that the Allies gained. But we must be sincere about who paid the invoice. The bill turned into not paid with the aid of the British taxpayer alone. It become paid by way of the topics of the empire who have been compelled to lend their hard work and their resources to a master who had no aim of paying them lower back. The sterling trap turned into one of the maximum hit economic operations in history. It saved the British financial system from collapse. It preserved the fee of the pound for a technology. It allowed Britain to retreat from empire without facing immediate financial ruin. But it became a victory sold with fraud. It became a swindle of imperial proportions. And it serves as a darkish lesson within the strength of forex. If you manage the banking machine, in case you manage the foreign money you can steal, more wealth with a fountain pen than a navy can scouse borrow with weapons. The British Empire knew this better than all of us. They found out that the remaining electricity of empire became no longer simply to rule the land, however to personal the debt. And while the time got here to settle debts, they proved that the simplest thing greater dangerous than an enemy is a chum who holds your pockets. I'm John, and that is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to live in advance of the curve due to the fact while the history books are written, you will want to be a few of the few who noticed it.